can hear.
Very good. So we are, if I'm not mistaken, we are at 9A2, and we are about to start a very interesting story and discussion. Now I'm going out on a limb. I mean, and maybe it'll be interesting to you, maybe not. Like I think it's interesting. And what we've come to, the reason that this story is being introduced is because we keep on trying to juggle what the various types of sacred scripture might require. What are the rules for different kinds of sacred scripture with regard to writing them and producing them? And our Mishnah started out with making a distinction between Torah scrolls and tefillin and mezuzot. But the Mishnah doesn't mention a Megillah by explicitly. In the workings of our Gemara, we've ended up now at a point where we've introduced the idea that perhaps the distinctions from other traditions that we've also collected, the Breitot that we've also collected, we've come up to through various ways to get to the point where it might be that certain distinctions would apply to a Megillah as opposed to a Torah scroll, as opposed to tefillin and mezuzot. And the questions that we had were, well, we can understand why a Torah scroll should be different than tefillin and mezuzot, but why should a Megillah be different than all other writings? Right? It's a kind of a Passover question. Why should this scroll be different than all other scrolls? So the answer at the end of 9A1 is that the Megillah has its own explicit requirement that it be written in a very special way. And now this is the back to the beginning distinction. And this ends up now making us recognize that the Torah scrolls, paradoxically, have a more lenient, so to speak, or a more expansive set of possibilities for being written than other types of scrolls, such as a Megillah or such as tefillin and mezuzot. Those holy writings need to be written only in Hebrew, right? But a Torah scroll either can be written in any language we want, or according to Rabbi Shimon and Gamliel, it can be written in Greek. Not any language, but it can be written in Greek. And that's what we're up to now. What gives with the Greek? Why is the Greek such an acceptable possibility for a Torah scroll? Okay, let's start from the beginning of the paragraph on 9A2, the right-hand side, a few lines down, like 6 lines down or so, from the top, where it says the Gemara therefore amends. Okay, so I hope everybody has that. Who's going to read for us today? Going once, going twice.
Okay.
All right. That's what you get for missing a week or two.
Yeah.
No, now you just muted yourself. Now you unmuted yourself. Good. Go.
Oh, we're okay. Okay. The Gemara therefore amends this part of the Baraita as well. Rather, say the Baraita as follows. And our rabbis, that is Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, did not permit scripture to be written in any foreign language other than Greek.
Okay.
And it was taught further in the Baraita. Rabbi Yehuda said, even when our rabbis, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, permitted the use of Greek, they permitted it only for a Torah scroll because of the incident with King Ptolemy.
Okay, that's what we got up to. So this is only a Torah scroll, and whatever we would think the Torah scroll should have the most limited, stringent requirements. The opposite. Only the Torah scroll gets this specific dispensation of being able to be written in Greek. So now we have the story that is told here. King Talmud, I love the note. Look at the note 17.
Note 17, the king of Egypt.
Yeah, parentheses.
Rashi, according to Rashi.
Right, according to Rashi, Talmud was a king of Egypt, right? According to all other commentators, no, he was the king of Sweden. You know, it's like this is a classic art scroll kind of a note that the sun shines in the day. How do we know? Because there's a Tosfot in Avodah Zarah that mentions that the sun shines during the day. So that's how we know that this fact. So okay, all right. So the point is, Talmud was I mentioned it last time, was the inheritor of Alexander the Great's half of Alexander the Great's empire, and based in Egypt, but including a lot of the whole northern Mediterranean, African area, and going down into some of the Middle East. And his counterpart, who inherited the other northern part, was the Seleucid Empire. Seleucus is the way we say it in Hebrew. I never know how to say it in Greek. But and those are the Greeks. Those are the guys that we fought against in the Hanukkah story. But this is approximately, maybe a little less than 100 years before this, right? Before the Hanukkah story. So we're talking in the 3rd century BCE. This ruler of Egypt is involved in the following story. Okay, here we go.
As it was taught in a Baraita, there was an incident with King Ptolemy, that he gathered 72 elders of Israel and placed them in 72 houses. And he did not reveal to them at first for what purpose he had gathered them.
Okay, so this is a part of a story. There's another version of this story that's written. It's called the Letter of Aristeas. We have it. And it tells another version of the same story. And I wanted to just check the dates here. 285 to 246 BCE. So approximately 100 years before the Hanukkah story. Talmud was interested in creating what became the greatest world library in ancient times. And he was interested in collecting all of the written traditions of all of his conquered peoples and of the world. So this is, the beginnings of the Alexandrian library. So in his efforts to do that, he also wanted to get the Jewish writings, right? So this story is obviously only centering on what he did with the Jews, but we know that he actually was acquiring all kinds of written products from every culture that he was the ruler of. We are in 9A2, the middle of the right-hand column, the story of King Talmud. Here what happened was that he wanted this Hebrew document to be translated into Greek. And this is the story, this is the foundational story of the Greek translation called the Septuagint. Septuagint means the 70. We have here that it's a rounded off number. It really was 72 elders, and he puts them all in their own scriptorium, isolated from each other, and it's their job to translate the Torah. But he doesn't tell them that first. Go ahead.
He visited each one of them and said to them individually, "Write for me a Greek translation of the Torah of Moses, your teacher. The Holy One,
Okay, so
blessed.
stop. So
Yep.
what's the setup here? The setup is that he collects these 72 people and they don't know why they're there, right? According to this story. And then he isolates each one of them before telling them why they're there. So that means that he just doesn't tell them ahead of time when they're all together so that they can converse with each other and develop a plan. How can we do this so that we won't step on each other's toes, so that we'll produce a translation that we can all agree on? No, he's testing them, and he wants to see whether if he puts these individuals in isolation, their product, each of the 72 translations, how are they going to line up with each other? You know, how well will they cohere with each other? Or, do they themselves know what it is? Are they going to argue about what the words mean? So this is the test. This is the preconditions that he sets up. And now we have the further historical report.
So he says, write for me a Greek translation of the Torah of Moses, your teacher. The Holy One, blessed is he, placed counsel in each of their hearts, and all of them independently arrived at a common decision about how to translate the various words of the Torah. And they wrote for him in Greek, God created in the beginning. They also wrote, I shall make man in image and form.
Okay, etc. We're going to get to those examples in a minute. So what happened was a miracle, right? And God made sure that each of these independent 72 individuals came up with the same decisions about how to translate different phrases. Obviously, if it says buy it his house, there's no problem. Different, most, I don't know, there are all kinds of words that there's no question about how to translate it. But how do you translate syntax? How do you translate, idioms? How do you translate certain, profound religious, poetic statements? So what God did was God entered into the heart of each one of these translators and straightened it out the path so that when they all emerged with their 72 independent products, they were all identical. They all had the same translation. A miracle. Okay, so we're going to now go through a whole long list of some of the decisions that they had to make, and we'll get to that in a second. But this is meant to be an answer to our original question, right? Our original question was, what gives with the Greek? And why only the Torah scroll? Why can't everything else be written in this language, right? So how does this, and the rest, the rest of the story is just various textual details. That's the story. So what does this story actually do for us? So we can read this story, and again, I made a kind of a little joke there. It was very, very subtle. I have to admit it myself.
And it went over my head.
So that the story begins, the king of Egypt collects these Jewish scholars, puts them into separate rooms, and tells them each to translate the Torah. Okay, then I said, and now the historical record adds that God came into each one of their hearts. That's the subtle joke. Okay, right? The historical documents don't talk about God. We do. So, the story as a historical anecdote, whether it's true or not, would be, so the king collected the 72 people, put them into isolation, and voila, look at that. What an amazing coincidence. They came out with the same translation. Okay. There's a little element here that's added, that God did this. This is God's work. God came into each one of their hearts. Okay. So, but we can read these things again as historically minded or as religiously minded. If we read this historically, then, I mean, we know that there is such a thing that was produced called the Septuagint. And it seems from the letter of Aristeas, as well as this rabbinic legend, it seems to have come about through some official sponsorship from the powers that be. Okay, so these are worldly ways of talking about things, political power and the production of culture through the exerting of political power. So if we look in that, just in those terms, how do we answer our question? Why is the Torah acceptable in Greek? Josie, you have to unmute. Can't do anything about it unless you unmute. No, you're muted. You're muted. You're muted. I see your lips moving, but you're muted. Now you're not muted.
It's because God is part of the story.
I'm asking in terms of historical power politics kinds of ways. Forget God. God is not a historical explanation. So if we talk about this historically, what's going on?
With the power of this ruler of Egypt.
Yeah. So go ahead, follow through. What about that power?
Well, these were his subjects, so he could command them to do whatever he wanted.
Yes.
And you mentioned the beginnings of the famous library of Alexandria. So it's more to his credit. He's an important figure and he did great things.
He did great things for sure. But the key things that I'm picking up from what you're saying is we are subservient to this man.
Yeah, he's in charge.
We are not independent operators. In fact, one of the sort of like meta ways of looking at the story is that even though we are subject to Talmud, there's a miracle here that when we're locked up in our own little rooms, we become independent operators and we make our own decisions. But politically speaking, that's a joke. Politically, we're not independent operators. He's watching over us. He's supervising what product will eventually be released. So the fact that the Septuagint gets created and becomes acceptable as an alternative to the Torah would be understood from kind of like simple, no nonsense historical thinking as, because there was no choice here. There was no choice. We're simply ratifying the reality that we have been pushed into. Because if we're going to be, said to, we reject the Septuagint, then who are you to? The king, the emperor said this is absolutely perfectly good, right? So there's a certain pressure that exists here from outside the Jewish community, and the decision to allow the Torah its existence as a Greek document becomes a kind of a bowing to historical facts. Now, some of the other historical facts, again, not in a mythological way, but the story still talks about this, is that more and more Jews in the Greek diaspora don't know Hebrew, don't understand Hebrew. So the fact that we are living under Talmud's rule is not just a question of being afraid of his power and might. It's also the brute fact that living under Talmud has changed Jewish life to such an extent that we are more Greek in our language than we are Hebrew. And yet we still have an identifiable ethnic identification and sense of belonging, and we're connecting up to the Torah. So the Septuagint is our vehicle. So it would be making the best of it. We make the best of it, and we allow the Torah, and only the Torah, to be written in Greek. Historically speaking, again, the Septuagint develops over time. It takes a couple of hundred years for the Septuagint translation to cover all of the books of the Bible. So at the beginning, it only covered the 5 books of Moses. It didn't, the translation wasn't yet made for the prophets and the writings until generations after generations. So what I'm trying to say is that this would be a kind of a materialistic and historically responsible way to read the story. Okay? Yeah, Stuart.
Well, it goes both ways. The Ptolemy is relying on the prestige of the, what he calls the sages or the elders, who I assume are the rabbis.
Well, there are no rabbis, remember.
It's what?
This is 300 years before there are rabbis.
Okay.
But sages, they didn't get called rabbis, but yes, they were the sages.
I mean, but they're benefiting from his imprimatur. He's benefiting from their legitimacy, and so it's mutually reinforcing. This is for whatever reason, it's not clear. He wants to have the best translation in his library because that makes the library more, authoritative, and they want his blessing, if I can use that word, to produce this translation. So everybody's. I realize that's a materialistic, what you would call a materialistic explanation, right, but that seems to be what's going on here.
Right, and that brings up the question of how much, again, how much agency do we credit the Jewish community with? How much do we want this translation, or how much are we pushed to this translation? And we have it, as I mentioned it last week, I think also, the whole question, for instance, even down to today, but certainly in modern times, what's the role of the vernacular, whether it was German or now English, in Jewish practice? Do we embrace it enthusiastically, or do we sort of grit our teeth and make the best of it, and wish we didn't have to make compromises, but we do it anyway? So when the translation is being produced in the 3rd century BCE, how much of this is, again, wow, this is a great idea. Oh, let's push this out into so many other communities. Let's make the Torah even more accessible to everybody. That kind of enthusiasm. Or is it, hey, did you notice how nobody, everybody's sleeping when we read the Torah? We better start doing something about this.
Right.
So when we were learning Ta'anit, the previous tractate that we were learning, we had a whole discussion about when the Torah was translated into Greek, it was a day of fasting. Right, because that was expressing the viewpoint that this is a terrible thing that happened. So, and then other people would say, are you kidding? You know how many Jewish people were saved as Jews because it was finally made into Greek? So it cuts always simultaneously in all of these different kinds of directions. So this would be without bringing in the God, out of the machine that drops down into the stage, right? That the story does. And that brings us back to Josie. You were mentioning God before. If we bring God in, then we're not talking history, right? God is not a historical force. It's not a historical element. Nothing, historians don't talk. And then God appeared on Mount Sinai and gave the Torah to the Jewish people. That's not history. It's religion. It's faith, it's myth. So this story brings God into the picture. And if we do bring God into the picture, then what might be a slightly different way of looking at this story as functioning to answer our question?
God says it's okay that I don't know Hebrew, but I can hear it in English, or I don't know Hebrew, so I can hear it in Greek.
We get a hechsher here from God, right? We get God's stamp of approval. Not only that, we sort of get a Ruach HaKodesh, right? We get a divine inspiration, because that's what happens, even though it's written in a kind of a roundabout way. God entered into the hearts of each one of these translators and enabled the translators to do the right translation. So another way of reading this story is, why the Torah and no other book? Why is the Torah allowed to be written in Greek? And also, surprisingly, the Torah of all things is allowed to be written in Greek? And the answer is yeah, because this was a product of divine inspiration. The Greek translation, not the Persian translation, not the Eitz Chaim translation, all of those wonderful works of committees and so on, those are human endeavors, and they're always going to be partially okay and partially not okay. But the Septuagint is thanks to God. The Septuagint has a divine imprimatur on it, right? So therefore, it's a product of God's spirit, of God's intervention. Therefore, it's okay, and it's only okay where it happened, where it applied. So this becomes the rationale for this legal decision.
So
Yeah, Sylvia.
I have a historic question to ask, which is that the assumption is that there was total agreement on this translation.
Mhm.
Has the Greek been translated into either English or German?
Yes.
And how does it compare with what we have today? What we're using?
Hold on to that question, because now we're going to go through a whole bunch of examples from the Greek translation, obviously filtered through the Talmud, and therefore coming back into Aramaic and Hebrew. But we'll come back to your question later. It's a good question. Okay, so just let's be patient about that. Now let's go into these examples. There are numerous examples that the Talmud brings of tricky original Hebrew verses and how they were smoothed out and made palatable or understandable in the Greek translation. And we already had two examples. Okay, so the first one, let's just go back. And they wrote, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines from the bottom of 9a2 on the right-hand side, right?
And they wrote for him in Greek, God created in the beginning.
Okay, so what's that all about? So if you look at note 19.
Note 19 says, rather than as it actually appears in Genesis 1:1, Bereshit bara Elohim, in the beginning created God, heaven and earth. For had they preserved the sequence of the original, Ptolemy might misconstrue the Greek word for in the beginning to be the proper name of another deity who created God. That's Rashi's interpretation, since one would expect the name of the creator to appear first in the verse.
Right. We would imagine if this is about God that we would have God be the first word to be mentioned. And also the syntax in Hebrew is Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, created God, heaven and earth, right? So it's a kind of a flipping, it's a poetic flipping of the verb and the subject, right? It could have been Bereshit Elohim bara et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. God could have been the name, the second word in the sentence instead of the third word. But of course, we understand it to be in the beginning, created God, heaven and earth. God is the subject, the actor, and created is the verb, and the object of the creation is heaven and earth. But in order to not make a mistake of saying, oh, in the beginning is the name of an entity, right? Bereshit is the name of some god or some demiurge. And Bereshit, bara Elohim, Bereshit created God, right? Created the other, or the Elohim is the demiurge, and the Bereshit is the original, God. So in order to avoid that misunderstanding, they switched around the syntax, and they made the syntax in the Greek much smoother, right? Yeah, Sylvia.
I don't know any Hebrew syntax, period. is it, what's the relationship of the noun and the verb in ancient Hebrew?
It could go either way.
It goes either way. Because, for instance, in modern German, it's the reverse.
What do you mean? What's the reverse?
That we do it in English. So, you know, this doesn't mean much to me unless I understand it in relation to what.
So so you're being too vague for me.
Uh-huh.
In English, what are you saying is the case in English?
It goes noun verb.
Usually, but
Usually.
not always, and especially in poetic stuff, you can sometimes turn it around.
But if you
right?
take German, it's usually flipped.
But in German, it's the convention is usually the other way around.
Right. So
Right.
I'm asking, what
In
is
Hebrew,
the
no,
usual-
in Hebrew it goes one way or the other.
That's what I wanted.
But
to know.
let's put it this way: a lot of times, let's say the classic case, as I'm thinking about it, the classic case is verb then noun, verb and then subject. Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor, and thus spake God to Moses. So spake comes first, and then God is the speaker, right? It doesn't say Hashem diber el Moshe lemor, right? So I would say, thinking about it, in biblical Hebrew, it's very, very common for the verb to come first. Okay, so just a note, those who have studied a little Zohar know that the Zohar translates those first words exactly the way that the Gemara says they were afraid that they would translate. Right, the Zohar exactly reads that verse as that God created God, that there is this mysterious process within God for God to become a God that can create the world. God has to create a different identity for God. That's really actually the rejected possibility here becomes one of the major ways that the Zohar understands the Torah. Okay, so this is one thing that they did. They wanted to avoid any misunderstanding. They turned it into God, the noun first, the subject first. Okay, they also wrote,
I shall make man in image and form.
Okay, what's the difference from the original? Let's look at 20.
Verse 20, no, 20 rather. Instead of accurately translating Naaseh Adam, let us make man, which could also give rise to the mistaken notion of several deities, again, according to Rashi. Others point out that the elders also altered the next part of the verse by rendering Batsalmo Kedumato as in image and likeness, rather than the accurate in our image and our form, so that Ptolemy should not attribute image and form to God.
Right. It says Bitsalmeinu Kidmutenu, our image, our appearance, our form. So that's the original. And they took out the our altogether in the second part of the verse. And in the first part of the verse, they turned it into singular. I will make the human being according to a form and image. Right? So what were they trying to avoid? They were trying to avoid two things. Right? The first example we had, hold on a second, I'll get to Stuart's note in a second. The first one, they were trying to avoid thinking that there's a God that creates a God, right? The second one, this example, they take out, God says in the original Hebrew, let us create the human being. So again, is there a council of forces that God is working with in conjunction to create the human being? No, only God is the creator, and there's no implication at all that there are any other partners with God in creating the human being, number one. So that's the first fix that they make. And the second fix, what's the second fix?
Changing the plural, the first person plural to first person singular.
No, that's the first fix.
Okay.
What's the second fix?
They leave out the personal, I forget what it's called. They leave out the our image and form and just make
So
it.
what
as
does
if
that do?
it's-
Why is that important? It's not
That I don't
simply
know.
about plural and single. It's about whether God has an image.
Hmm.
They don't want you to make the mistake to think that God has an image. If we say that God says, I will create the human being in my image, that means God has an image. But no, God doesn't have an image. God is completely incorporeal. So there is no body or image to God. So in order for people not to make the mistake to think that God has a body, that God has an image, we say, no, we're going to translate this and take out any implication that the human being is created in God's image. Okay, so we have here, in this particular case, let's just note, you get a benefit, but you also have a loss. Right? One of the most important teachings that we talked about it a little bit in Pirkei Avot this morning. Human dignity is founded. The notions of human dignity in Jewish thought are founded in the idea that we are created in God's image. Right. So we take that close identification with God as a really important message. Here, it's taken away in a major kind of way. Let me look now in chats, because there are chats here going on. So basically, they are improving on the original. So I think my next comment puts that into question. Mark Weinstein says, that was Stuart's comment. So why does the original have these misleading formulations? Oi, right? Why the heck couldn't God just write the Torah clearly? What is wrong with this complex persona that we call God? Every student of the Torah has asked that question, and usually gritting their teeth and go, come on already. What do people want to answer to that question? I'm making a little fun, but it's a serious question. What's our response to that question? Why isn't the Torah clearer?
Well, it may not be clear to us, but it might have very well been clear to the readers at the time, to both the writers and readers at the time.
So that means that the Torah just, was only written for that particular generation?
No, I'm not going there. I'm just saying, as a matter of fact.
Okay. So, but then again, that seems to be then a failing of the Torah. If the Torah was written for, a specific audience, and that audience doesn't exist anymore, what good is it? Geraldine?
I think it's so we think about it, so we adjust it to how the world changes.
Okay, so it allows for a little more complexity in our understanding. Mark continues. So why does the original have these mistakes? That's the first thing. More important, why isn't the initial statement correct? Now that I'm not clear what that means. The initial statement means the statement in the Hebrew itself?
Yeah, because the Hebrew statement says clearly that God has form.
So that's not necessarily the case.
What's the point of possessive?
The idea is, for instance, Rav Sadia Gaon was also concerned about this. Look, every traditional Jewish reader has had to grapple with the question. What sense do you make of this? And for instance, Rav Sadia says that our means the one that we, royal we, have chosen. I have 15 possibilities of different ways a human being could look like a Martian. That's a form. That's an image that I could have created human beings to look like. So I have all of these on my drafting table here, and this is the one I like. This one the best. So that's how Sadia reads our image, right? The one that we like the best. Obviously he's struggling with this problem. So we have that answers are A, possibly this was just really clear. It was not ambiguous once upon a time, but it's become more ambiguous over time. Geraldine says, no, it's not a question of unclear. It allows for richness of interpretation. Any other possibilities?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah. Go ahead, Josie. Yeah.
I see the word our kind of like the royal we, that it's an honorary way of speaking for God.
Right.
You.
Right. So that's a very respectable, long-standing tradition. That's how we understand it. But there are others that understand it, differently. I'm just going to show you for a second. Well, no, I won't. Yeah, I will. So this is this is an edition of the Chumash, and this is of the first half of the book of Genesis, with traditional commentators. So the traditional commentators, Rashi, and the Aramaic translation, and Rashbam, and Nachmanides, and a few other translations. So here is the first page of this Chumash. There's the text here about Bereshit bara Elokim, that, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. And there's commentary, right? And here's 2 more pages, no Hebrew text, no original, no original biblical text, because the commentators are just still going at it. And there they are, they're still going at it. No Hebrew text yet, because they're still busy with the first few words of the Torah. And there's 1 more page. And then finally, we get to another page with 1 line of Hebrew text, and then more translation, more commentary. And then there's the commentaries, and there's the commentaries, et cetera, et cetera. So, so that's our tradition of commentary. Among those various discussions, 1 point that I want to bring up for now by Nachmanides is that the reason that this text is so obscure is because it's talking about something that is so obscure, that there is no possibility in human language of saying any of this clearly. It's not that there's a defect in the choice of the terminology, in the choice of the syntax, in the choice of the words. The defect is in human language itself. That human language is just inadequate to completely clarify and encompass and comprehend what this mystery is all about. And that's why, for instance, the Zohar just works on it some more and 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 works on it some more, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's another response to this. David.
Actually, it's written in a very human way. I might come down to the kitchen in the morning, put on a pot of hot water and say, let's see, not let me see, let's see what flavor tea shall we make this morning? So I mean, this blending of I and we is a very human approach.
Good.
The comment might be, the question might arise, is God really so human-like? Instead of, are we so?
Right. Is the God that how much are we want to create God in our image? So Mark, you have to fix your text. Your text is an illustration of the inadequacy of the text.
Yeah, but yet what I tried to say is revere it. I don't know how to spell it, and plus I don't know how to type. But yet we revere the text.
Correct.
So you can't say that the text is inadequate and that we should revere the text. If the text is inadequate, then the text is just a vehicle.
The text is the
so
gateway.
revering the text is a form of idolatry.
No, the text is a gateway. Yes, I mean, anything can be turned into an idol, for sure. Even the Torah can be turned into an idol. But that's not the same thing as not revering anything. Revering it as an absolute makes it into an idol. Revering the Torah as a word, as a communication, as an invitation, as I say, an opening, a gateway into this embracing the mystery and embracing the complexity and embracing the holiness that's involved. That's what we're saying that this Torah does.
But isn't the simplest explanation that the first book of the Torah is an archaic presentation of a set of ideas that don't get straightened out until the Ten Commandments?
I don't think they
which
got
happens
straightened out
much
at the
later in the book.
I don't think they ever got straightened out. So I think that you know, that's I don't think that's the case. But yes, many people would demystify this whole thing by saying, yeah, that's what I was saying. The distinction between a kind of historical approach, a materialistic approach, and a religiously oriented approach. And they would say, yes, look, no offense, Sylvia, but Sylvia and I have ongoing discussions about different mitzvot, different practices. Isn't this just simply an ancient way of trying to control disease or so on and so forth? That's a very, you know, as I say, time-honored approach to looking at these texts. These are ancient texts, and what do you want? They betray the limitations of the perspective of the authors of the time. They had limited information. They had limited understanding. So of course it's going to come out in a kind of a gobbledygook that doesn't work for us. Yeah, that's one approach that many people take. Some people take that approach, and then the more they get into it, the more they start saying, you know what, that's an oversimplification too. There's understanding here what I first dismiss as childish, primitive, misunderstanding actually is touching on something profound. So you can, even without jumping into the God swimming pool, you can start feeling that maybe it's not so faulty. But then there's the approach that says, no, I think that this is a gift, right? Thank you, God, for giving us the Torah. Yeah, Sylvia.
A little quirky here. As I recall from long ago, and I don't know if this is still the accepted analysis of the Torah, but if we do go back to the concept that perhaps not all the Torah may not have been written all at the same time. As I recall, Genesis was one of the more sophisticated, one of the newer parts. And I'm thinking perhaps when it was written, it was trying to get at this, trying to make sense of the whole Torah and the concept of omniscience and omnipresence. And how do you frame that? And what does it really mean? As and then the Torah goes through various stories of how we got there, but maybe this is kind of a summation in just a couple of words of the concepts that are flowing through the entire Torah.
Okay. Yeah, these are, is dating where these things come from and when they were added to each other, when they were first independently created as pieces on their own, and then when they were combined. That's a whole scholarly
Right.
discipline that I don't have an opinion about in terms of, yes, I think that's earlier, that's later. I can repeat what I read. And very often what I read is, well, this one says this is clearly earlier and this is clearly later. And the other one goes, are you kidding? This is clearly later and this is clearly earlier. So, it's not where I get my nourishment from.
But it could be, but even if it's all contemporaneous, It could be a distillation.
Absolutely. I think so. I think, the great 20th century teacher of Judaism for everybody except the most, closeted, benighted, am I using bad value judgment words? But Franz Rosenzweig. Franz Rosenzweig lived at the beginning of the 20th century, and he was probably the most influential Jewish teacher for modern Judaism that came around. He wrote with Martin Buber the beginnings of a German translation of the Torah. He was dissatisfied with all the German translations that came before, and he tried to create a German translation that would preserve the difficulty of the text. Exactly the opposite of the Septuagint, what we're in the middle of doing. We still have many, many more examples. But the choice, and I wrote a few columns back in the old days when there was such a thing as the printed Kol Emunah. So years and years and years ago, I wrote a few, like 3 essays on translation. There are choices that translators, make, and to oversimplify, one way to do it is let's make a readable translation that, that in its own terms has felicity and has meaning and coherence and so on. And the other, and is true to the overall message of the original. And another way of looking at it is, let's make this as closely parallel to the original at the sacrifice of the beauty of the text of the language as we're used to it, to make it reflect the way the original text works. And the original text for Rosenzweig and for Buber was a text that really had tremendously startling linguistic quirks. So they worked on that. But when he talked about the Bible as an overall literary product, he said, yes, there's P and there's Q and there's E. There are all these strands, and then there's R. Right? He said, I think that the one missing strand that the biblical scholars haven't really paid enough attention to is the R. What's the R? He said R stands for Rabbeinu, our teacher, the redactor. That the one who put it all together. The one, and of course the one could be many ones, and as you say, could the putting of it together also could take a while. So the Rabbeinu effort is the work of putting disparate voices, disparate perspectives, disparate syntax choices, and so on, and then stitching them all together, just the way a Torah is stitched together. Each parchment is stitched together. And it could have been this way, it could have been that way. There are, I talked about this in Torah study, whenever it was, a week and a half ago. One of the classic examples of questions of stitching together is the Torah portion of Yitro. Torah portion of Yitro has 2 pieces to it. It has the story of Yitro coming and returning Moses' family, reuniting the family. And then Yitro gives Moses really good advice about how to teach the Torah. And the second part of the Torah reading is giving of the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai, which supposedly clarifies the whole Torah. Baloney. But those are 2 separate pieces that are united in one Torah reading. And then there's a whole discussion that goes on for generations. Which piece came first? Did the 10 Commandments story happen first and then Yitro came afterwards? Or did Yitro come first and then he left and then the 10 Commandments were given? So the answer is, well, just look at the text. There's Yitro, is it at the front end of the text. And then there's the 10 Commandments is the second part of the text. And then so many people say, that's not the point though. there's an editorial choice that was made to flip the text. There was an editorial choice that was made to take a later story and put it first, and then the earlier story and put it second. So this is an ongoing discussion that you don't need, the latest Bible scholars to invent. Close readers of the Torah have always recognized that the Torah is, complicated and zigzaggy and full of surprises and full of imponderables. And then the question is, how do you view what you got? Is it, do we say, Rabbeinu, you're my teacher? Or do you simply say, I can dissect this corpse and I can show you every single organ and how it's related to each other, but you won't have a living being as a result of it. That's my editorial comment. Many biblical scholars would string me up on the nearest tree for saying that. So these are all questions of approach. What I want to do to get us back into our Gemara is to point out, even with the limited sampling that we've had, and we'll see more and more of them, the choice of the translation that the Gemara brings up is to simplify, right? To simplify the text and to make it less shocking, less ambiguous. But I want to again emphasize that choice is not about it. It's not improving it. It's thinning it out. It's taking one interpretive choice and throwing out all other interpretive choices. They are no longer even possible to be put into the text because the text has now been rearranged to exclude those other possibilities. So the translation is a thinning of the possible meanings that the text can convey. Who, and again, what is this about? Who are they trying to serve here? Are they serving Talmud, or are they serving the greater Jewish community when they do that? Are they simply saying, you know what, we have to bite the bullet. If we keep the text in its complexity, people are just going to go astray, going to make a lot of big, terrible theological mistakes, and they're going to start losing what it means to believe in one God. They're going to have all kinds of idolatrous ideas because the text is open to that. Or are they simply saying, well, for Talmud, this is good enough. When we will be involved in studying the text, we'll get into the minutiae and we'll get into the complexities. But for Talmud, let's not make him think that we are as primitive and as simple-minded as it might come out. Right? Is this again how we look toward the Goyim, or is this about simply saying let's do the best we can for a simplified, basic Judaism 101 for the masses, because that's what we need to do right now, right? These are questions that are going on in this discussion. Yeah, Stuart.
Well, one thing that's been troubling me through all this is that all of this translation business is the consequence of the Babel story, right? So we were all speaking one language, and I guess, I don't know whether there's midrash on this, but maybe that language was Hebrew. And then
what do you mean?
tried
What
to
a
build
question.
this. What's that?
What a question, of course.
Right. So then we tried to build the tower, and God said, and now you're all going to be speaking different languages, right? So you're going to be speaking modern German and Icelandic and Esperanto or whatever your language is. So you can't communicate with each other. I mean, is there ever commentary that we really shouldn't be trying to translate because if we're doing so, we're kind of undermining God's plan in having us speak different languages. Yeah, I mean, also, I've always thought, the Hebrew speakers, why was anybody left speaking Hebrew? It should have been, everybody should have been speaking. I mean, there was one group that got to maintain the original language and everybody else had to speak the new languages. So I just wonder whether there's midrash or thought about the connection between all of this translation project and
So the second part is the easy part. The second part is the easy part. The second part is that if we are still holding on to the original, it's like the original rays. We've got the original and it's still the best. So it's very much of putting us into a very privileged position. So the claim that Hebrew is the original language and we've still got it is a very powerful claim. So, and again, back to the political stuff, for a disempowered people, that can be very significant. I live in that kind of space a lot. When I critique the translations that I find in the Siddur and in the Chumash and so on, because I have, thank God, a life that has immersed me in Hebrew, I feel very empowered to be able to say, here's the Hebrew. The Hebrew is giving me so much else and so much more than what this secondary source, has chosen to give. And when I think about it in terms of interreligious stuff, I'm constantly made aware of the fact that my Christian colleagues mostly, and to a certain extent, whatever little interaction I have with Muslim colleagues, with regard to the Hebrew text, that is a text that they look to, their access to that text is filtered 99% of the time through translation. And I'm always, interested when I see what kind of translation they have and how they think they understand the text. I'm thinking about it, with checking the original and saying, okay, you know what? No, it may not be that way. Sometimes, I learn a lot from my Christian colleagues, even in terms of looking at my own text. But the idea of having access to the original is really precious. It's really, it's a game changer. And that was part of the decision, going back to your first part of the question, that was part of the decision of the Christian church, and this, is related to what we have here. We'll get to it a little bit more after we finish this discussion. In order to spread this word to the world, they decided to go with the vernacular and not to go with the original, right? As far as they're concerned, the Hebrew text is not sacred. The Greek text is sacred, right? So, and then the Latin text became sacred. They don't privilege the Hebrew text because they have that sense of, Jerome and whoever, they were inspired by God to supplant the text with a better text. So, translation is very much the vehicle for getting out into the world. When you ask why should we translate, the truth of the matter is that because we have no choice. Even when I'm talking English to you, you're translating.
Rabbi?
Yeah, Rich.
Yeah, so I think we've had this in Zohar class, but I wonder how much of an issue is the very original translation, which is going from thoughts to words.
Exactly.
And we're certainly guilty of it, and how,
right.
To what extent is God,
Absolutely, right. And that's a little bit of what I was saying before about the inadequacy of language per se, that the Ramban, who was a great mystic, was pointing out that language is translation, correct. Language is already translation. So yeah, absolutely, good.
So I have this really weird question that never occurred to me before, which is if in fact the Hebrew was translated into the Greek as it was, and the Greek into the Latin, and the Latin into the English, is the English that the non-Jewish world is using for the Bible, is the meaning different than our meaning would be?
Sometimes. I mean, there's.
Might that lead to really serious misinterpretations of what the Jewish thinking is
By whom?
by the non-Jewish world?
Who's one person's interpretation is somebody else's misinterpretation, and one person's misinterpretation is somebody else's interpretation. I mean, that's why we have different groups with different traditions. So
We're basically playing telephone with the original.
correct. Yeah.
I mean, the King James Version, the translation was very much based on the Hebrew text. It wasn't based on the Latin.
It's
On the
true.
Latin, it was.
There was because the King James Version,
But that was Protestant.
right? That was exactly the point. There was a revolutionary choice
Right.
to get away from the Catholic Church's Bible. That was the whole point. And for years, before King James was able to actually protect. He's like the Talmud. It was under
Like
his
Ptolemy,
auspices.
right?
But Tyndale, who the guys that did English translations before the King James were burnt at the stake
Right.
because they were betraying the authorized translation. Yeah. All right, let's get a couple more examples going, and then this is still a rich topic that we'll have even more material to deal with. So now we're up to the last two lines on 9A2.
They also wrote, and he completed on the sixth day, and he rested on the seventh day.
Okay, what's that? What kind of change and improvement did they make? Okay.
According to note 21,
Yeah.
excuse me, instead of precisely rendering V'chol Elohim,
Vayichal Elokim bayom hashvi'i.
thank you, as God completed on the seventh day the work that he did, and he ceased on the seventh day from all his work. Had they rendered this precisely, Ptolemy would have argued that the verse states that God did work on the seventh day. He would not have accepted the explanation of the sages that this completion does not refer to actual work, but rather to the very institution of the Sabbath, which completed the world that had previously lacked tranquil rest.
Okay, so it says literally in the Torah, and God completed on the seventh day all of God's work. So they fudged it. And what did they say? They changed seventh day into sixth day. Right? So this is, if we could have, and if we paid more attention to the first two examples, maybe would have had this as a question. But here it's clear. Here's a falsification of the text. Right? It's not simply flipping the syntax, and it's not simply sort of like smoothing out the meaning. Here we have taking seventh day and changing it to sixth day, right? Because they're taking the overall meaning of the text as understood by Jewish tradition, preserving that overall meaning, but then giving Talmud a text that will say that overall meaning in simple words so that he won't, God forbid, have material to argue against that meaning by reinterpreting the words. So as I said before, this is also, these examples, as we keep on going, are also paying attention to possibilities of interpretation that these translators are trying to rule out, right? They are trying to actually close down. When we talk about how the words of the Torah are so rich, there's so many ways that we can interpret them, and yet what happens in these translations is there are many, many ways to interpret these texts, but don't you dare interpret it this way, right? That's what we have here. Okay, a little bit more.
They also wrote, male and female, he created him. and they did not write he created them as in the original.
Right.
They
So,
also wrote
okay,
come.
that's what's that all about? 22?
No, 22 from Genesis 5:2. Had they rendered male and female, he created them. Ptolemy could have misinterpreted this to mean that two humans had been separately created, each a composite of male and female. Therefore, the elders substituted him for them to make it clear that only one human was created, that human was a composite of male and female and was subsequently separated into man and woman. And then there's a bunch of references.
Right. So what would have been so terrible? What would have been so terrible, right? So so here they changed the plural again into singular. Bara otam? No, bara oto. Okay, and because it could have meant that you could have imagined that that God created more than one human being. So what would be so terrible about that? Let's do our own. So what?
But in fact, God did create two human beings, Adam and then Chava.
Yeah,
The
but
fact that Chava came from a rib of Adam is neither here nor there.
Right. So here we go. Here we go into the complexities and mysteries of multiple sources in the Torah. This comes from one source. Earlier we had, if you look at, hold on a second. If you look at Genesis,
yeah, there's two stories.
right? If you look at Genesis, this should be, what do they do here? For 22, they give you the wrong, whatchamacallit.
They said 5-2.
Yeah, it's not, but that 5:2 is another place, right? Where it says Zachar u'Nekeva B'ra'am. But look in, or I will read it for you, verse 27 in chapter 1. And the Almighty created the human being, Adam, in his image, right? In the image of the Almighty did he create him, Oto. Zachar u'Nekeva bara otam. Male and female did God create them. So we have a them already back then. The fact that this is 5:2 that's being picked is interesting. That 5:2 is the introduction to a genealogical text. This one was created, and then this one lived, and then this one died, and then this one had children, and so on and so forth. Which might be what they were trying to say here, that they want to keep it, they want to keep us remembering that the beginning was only one human being. What's the point? I said we'll have to, okay, well, real quick, and then we're going to close down for today. The Mishnah has a whole discussion about this. The Mishnah in Sanhedrin says then when witnesses are coming to testify in a capital case, the witnesses have to be admonished that what they're bringing evidence about is something so serious that they should really be careful and be absolutely certain that what they're saying is the truth and nothing but the truth, etc. And they say, because look, if you're talking about that you want to testify this person owes money, this person hurt somebody else, that's all retrievable. Let's say there was a mistake made, we can fix it afterwards. But here, what you're doing is you're testifying in a capital case, and the result of this testimony is the loss of a human life. And the reason that the human being was created singular, one human being only, and not many human beings were created at the beginning, is to teach you that if you cause the loss of one life, then you have destroyed a world. Right? Don't don't minimize the significance of even one single life. So that's one of the ways that the rabbi said it's so important that we think of this as only one human being. God creates the heavens and the cosmos and zillions. And then when it comes to people, God doesn't create 3 billion people all at once. God could have done that too. No, God creates one human being because of the preciousness of one life. All right, that's going to be it for today. And we'll, next week we're not meeting. Next week we're not meeting because we have the Purim celebration, and we'll hopefully can resume after that. Sei gesund.